The stagecoach lurched violently as its wheels struck another rut in the dusty Arizona road, and Katherine Morgan gripped the wooden seat beneath her with white-knuckled determination, certain this journey would shake loose every tooth in her head before she ever reached Jerome. The year was 1878, and she had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Philadelphia with nothing but a battered trunk, her mother's Bible, and an unshakable conviction that God had called her to bring salvation to the lawless souls of the western frontier. The other passengers, a portly merchant and his pinch-faced wife, had stopped trying to make conversation with her somewhere around Kansas, clearly bewildered by a 22-year-old woman traveling alone to such a rough territory. Katherine pressed her handkerchief to her face as another cloud of red dust billowed through the window. Her dark hair, once neatly pinned beneath her bonnet, had begun escaping in damp tendrils around her flushed cheeks. The Arizona heat was unlike anything she had experienced back east, a dry, relentless assault that seemed to suck the moisture from her very bones. Still, she refused to complain. Missionaries did not falter at the first sign of discomfort. The driver's shout broke through her thoughts. "Jerome, folks." 10 minutes out, Katherine's heart quickened as she leaned toward the window, eager for her first glimpse of the town that would become her new home. The Missionary Society had written that Jerome was a copper mining town built into the side of Mingus Mountain, desperate for moral guidance and Christian influence. They had painted a picture of lost souls waiting to be shepherded back to righteousness, of saloons that needed to be shuttered and gambling dens that required reformation. What she saw as the stagecoach crested the final rise made her breath catch, though not entirely with inspiration. Jerome clung to the mountainside at a precarious angle, its buildings seeming to defy gravity itself. Wooden structures painted in fading colors climbed the slope in haphazard rows, connected by steep streets that looked more suitable for mountain goats than horses. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and even from this distance, she could hear the faint sounds of industry, the rhythmic pounding of machinery from the mines. The stagecoach rattled down the main street, and Katherine observed everything with growing apprehension. Rough-looking men in dusty work clothes stood outside establishments with names like the Silver Star Saloon and the Lucky Copper. A few women in brightly colored dresses that showed far too much ankle lounged on a second-story balcony, calling out to passers-by. This was indeed a place in need of saving. When the stage finally shuddered to a halt, Katherine gathered her skirts and accepted the driver's weathered hand to help her down. Her legs trembled from the long journey, and she had to steady herself against the coach for a moment. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the thin mountain air made her slightly dizzy. "Miss Morgan," a reedy voice called out, and Katherine turned to see a tall, severe-looking woman approaching. She wore a high-collared black dress despite the heat, and her gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features. "I'm Mrs. Eldridge. The Missionary Society wrote that you would be arriving today." "Yes, how do you do?" Katherine extended her hand, relieved to find at least one familiar form of civilization in this wild place. "I'm very pleased to meet you." Mrs. Eldridge's handshake was brief and cool. "Your accommodations are ready. I've prepared a room in my boarding house. Tomorrow we'll discuss your duties and the work that needs to be done here." Her lips pursed as she glanced around the bustling street. "As you can see, Jerome is a cesspool of vice and degradation. The men here care for nothing but copper and whiskey in that order." As the driver unloaded Katherine's trunk, a commotion erupted from one of the nearby saloons. Raised voices carried through the swinging doors, followed by the crash of breaking furniture. Katherine jumped at the sound, her hand flying to her throat. "You'll need to grow accustomed to such displays," Mrs. Eldridge said dryly. "Violence and drunkenness are daily occurrences. The town has a sheriff, but he's often overwhelmed. We lost our last minister 6 months ago. The poor man couldn't tolerate the conditions and returned to Santa Fe." Catherine's resolve hardened. If anything, Mrs. Eldridge's grim assessment only strengthened her conviction. These people needed guidance more than she had imagined. "I won't be leaving," she said firmly. "I came here to do God's work, and I intend to see it through." Something that might have been approval flickered in Mrs. Eldridge's eyes. "We shall see. Come along then. I'll have someone bring your trunk." The boarding house was a narrow 2-story structure wedged between a general store and a lawyer's office. Inside, it was surprisingly clean and well kept, though sparsely furnished. Mrs. Eldridge led Katherine up a steep staircase to a small room with a single window overlooking the street. "Meals are served at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening," Mrs. Eldridge explained. "No men allowed above the first floor, no alcohol, and no unseemly behavior. Church services are held on Sundays in the schoolhouse, as we have no proper church building yet. That's one of the projects the Missionary Society hoped you might undertake, raising funds for a proper house of worship." Katherine set her carpetbag on the narrow bed and removed her bonnet. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a young woman far more rumpled and dusty than the pristine missionary who had left Philadelphia. "I'll begin wherever I'm most needed, perhaps visiting the sick or teaching Bible study." "There's a more pressing matter," Mrs. Eldridge said, moving to the window. She pointed toward the edge of town where several rough structures stood apart from the main buildings. "That's where many of the miners live, the ones who spend their wages on liquor instead of proper lodging. There's one man in particular who's become something of a concern, Quentin Jameson. He was raised Christian by all accounts, came from a good family in Texas. But since arriving in Jerome 2 years ago, he's fallen into the worst habits: drinking, gambling, brawling. Sheriff Thompson has arrested him more times than I can count." Katherine studied the ramshackle buildings with a mixture of trepidation and determination. "If he was raised in faith, then perhaps he can be brought back to it. I'll add him to my prayers." "Prayer alone won't reach a man like that." Mrs. Eldridge's tone was sharp. "He's beyond redemption, in my opinion. I mention him only so you'll know to keep your distance. He's dangerous when he's been drinking, and he's been drinking nearly every night for months." After Mrs. Eldridge departed, Katherine sat on the edge of her bed and allowed herself a moment of honest uncertainty. The reality of Jerome was far harsher than anything described in the Missionary Society's letters. This wasn't a quaint frontier town waiting eagerly for spiritual guidance. It was a hard, rough place where survival seemed to take precedence over salvation. But she hadn't come all this way to turn back at the first challenge. She unpacked her trunk, hanging her spare dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her few books on the washstand. Her mother's Bible, worn soft from years of reading, she placed beside the bed where she could reach it easily. That evening, she joined Mrs. Eldridge and the other boarders for supper. There were only 3 others. An elderly prospector named Mr. Hayes, who was mostly deaf, a young clerk named Timothy who worked at the assay office, and a middle-aged widow named Mrs. Chen, who helped Mrs. Eldridge with the cooking and cleaning. The meal was simple but well prepared: beans and cornbread with strong coffee. Timothy, who couldn't have been more than 19, seemed eager to talk. "How long do you plan to stay in Jerome, Miss Morgan? Most folks from back east don't last more than a few months. The heat and the dust drive them away." "I plan to stay as long as I'm needed," Katherine replied. "I understand the previous minister left rather quickly." "Reverend Paulson." Timothy nodded. Nice fellow, but he didn't have the constitution for this place. Tried to shut down the saloons, which didn't go over well with the miners. After someone threw a bottle through the schoolhouse window during his third sermon, he decided to seek opportunities elsewhere. Mrs. Eldridge made a disapproving sound. The men in this town have no respect for decency or order. They work like mules in those mines all week, then throw away their wages on rot-gut whiskey and loose women. It's a disgrace. Katherine sipped her coffee, thinking. Perhaps instead of trying to shut down the saloons immediately, I should focus on reaching the men where they are, showing them there's a better path through example and compassion rather than condemnation. A soft approach won't work here, Mrs. Eldridge said flatly. These men respond only to firmness and strict moral authority. But Katherine had seen enough of strict moral authority in Philadelphia to know it often drove people away rather than drawing them closer. She kept this thought to herself, however, not wanting to contradict her hostess on the first evening. After supper, Katherine retired to her room and knelt beside the bed for evening prayers. She prayed for strength, for wisdom, for the ability to truly help the people of Jerome find their way back to faith. And though she tried to dismiss the thought, she found herself praying specifically for Quentin Jameson, the fallen man Mrs. Eldridge had mentioned. Something about his story, a good man who had lost his way, resonated with her sense of purpose. Sleep came fitfully in the unfamiliar bed, punctuated by the sounds of the town that apparently never fully quieted. Distant piano music, raised voices, the occasional crack of gunfire. Katherine wondered what she had truly gotten herself into. The next morning, Mrs. Eldridge took Katherine on a tour of Jerome. They visited the schoolhouse, a sturdy building that served double duty as the town's church on Sundays. The teacher, a harried-looking woman named Miss Patterson, seemed grateful for Katherine's arrival. I try to include some moral instruction in my lessons, Miss Patterson explained, but with 30 children ranging from 5 to 15 years old, all in one room, it's a challenge. Many of them speak Spanish at home or Chinese. The mining company brings in workers from everywhere. Katherine was struck by the diversity of the children's faces, representing so many different backgrounds and cultures. Perhaps I could help with reading lessons, she suggested. Using the Bible as a text would serve both educational and spiritual purposes. Miss Patterson looked relieved. That would be wonderful, particularly with the older children. Some of them can barely read at all. They continued the tour, visiting the general store where Katherine was introduced to the proprietor, Mr. Walsh, a jovial man with mutton chop sideburns. "Welcome to Jerome, miss. If you need anything at all, you just let me know. We can order special items from Prescott if necessary." As they walked back toward the boarding house, Katherine noticed a group of miners emerging from one of the shafts, their faces blackened with dust, their clothes stiff with dried sweat and dirt. They looked exhausted beyond measure, stumbling toward the town with the grim determination of men who had earned their rest. "They work 10-hour shifts in those mines," Mrs. Eldridge said, following her gaze. "Dangerous work. Men die regularly from cave-ins, bad air, explosions. It's no wonder they turn to drink to forget their troubles, but that doesn't excuse their behavior." Katherine watched the miners with growing sympathy. These weren't evil men, they were desperate men, trapped in brutal circumstances with few comforts or consolations. How could she judge them for seeking relief in whatever way they could find it? That afternoon, she began preparing for her first Bible study session, scheduled for the following evening at the schoolhouse. She carefully selected passages about hope, redemption, and God's infinite capacity for forgiveness. If she was going to reach these hardened souls, She would need to offer them something more than lectures about their moral failings. As she worked, sitting at the small desk in her room, a sudden burst of shouting erupted from the street below. Katherine moved to the window and looked down to see two men grappling in the dirt, throwing wild punches while a crowd gathered around them, cheering and placing bets. One of the fighters was clearly winning, a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair who moved with surprising grace despite his obvious intoxication. He landed a solid punch that sent his opponent sprawling, then stood there swaying slightly, his chest heaving. "That's Jameson, Mrs." Eldridge's voice came from behind Katherine, making her jump. The older woman had entered without knocking. "See what I mean? The man's an animal." But as Katherine watched, Quentin Jameson extended his hand to help his fallen opponent to his feet. The other man, still dazed, accepted the help, and the two of them staggered together toward the nearest saloon, apparently friends again now that the fight had ended. The crowd dispersed, the entertainment over. "He helped him up," Katherine observed quietly. "After beating him senseless, Mrs." Eldridge retorted, "Don't romanticize these men, Miss Morgan. They're not noble savages waiting to be civilized. They're lost causes, most of them." But Katherine couldn't quite accept that assessment. Lost, perhaps, but not beyond finding again. That was the entire point of faith, wasn't it? That no one was ever truly beyond redemption. The next evening, Katherine stood before a disappointingly small gathering in the schoolhouse. Mrs. Eldridge sat in the front row, ramrod straight, along with Mrs. Chen and three other women Katherine hadn't met before. Timothy the clerk had come, along with Mr. Hayes, the elderly prospector. 8 people total, in a town of several hundred. Katherine swallowed her disappointment and opened her Bible. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'd like to start tonight by reading from Luke chapter 15, the parable of the lost sheep." She read the familiar words about the shepherd who left his 99 sheep to search for the one who had wandered away. When she finished, she looked up at her small audience. This parable reminds us that every single soul matters to God, not just the righteous, not just those who never stray, but especially those who have lost their way. The shepherd doesn't condemn the lost sheep. He searches for it with love and brings it safely home. Mrs. Eldridge shifted in her seat, clearly not entirely approving of this gentler message. But Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully, and Timothy leaned forward with interest. "Many people in this town are struggling," Katherine continued. "Working dangerous jobs far from their families, living in difficult conditions. It's easy to lose hope in such circumstances. But God's love is constant, even when we feel lost. Especially when we feel lost." She continued for another 20 minutes, aware that she was likely not delivering the fire and brimstone sermon Mrs. Eldridge had expected. But Katherine had never believed that fear was the best path to faith. Love, compassion, understanding, these were the tools that truly changed hearts. Afterward, as the small group dispersed, Timothy approached her. "That was real nice, Miss Morgan, different from Reverend Paulson's style. He was always telling us how we were all going to hell." Katherine smiled. "I prefer to focus on how we can find heaven, even here on earth, through God's grace." "You might have better attendance if you held these during the day on Sunday," he suggested. "Lots of the miners have Sunday off, though most of them spend it sleeping off Saturday night." It was a valid point. Katherine decided to speak with Miss Patterson about using the schoolhouse on Sunday afternoons. Perhaps a different time would draw more people. Over the next few weeks, Katherine threw herself into the work of ministry. She visited families, bringing food to those who were struggling and reading Bible stories to children. She assisted Miss Patterson at the school twice a week, helping the older children with their reading. She organized a women's prayer circle that met on Wednesday afternoons. But she was acutely aware that she wasn't reaching the people who needed her most. The miners, the gamblers, the men who spent their nights in the saloons, they remained distant, untouched by her efforts. She caught glimpses of them sometimes, rough men with haunted eyes, and her heart ached to find a way to offer them hope. Quentin Jameson she saw more than once, always at a distance. He was hard to miss, given his height and the way he seemed to attract trouble like a lightning rod. She watched him break up a fight one evening, pulling two smaller men apart with apparent ease. Another time, she saw him leaving the general store with supplies, walking with the careful precision of someone who was drunk, but trying not to show it. Each time, she felt a strange pull, an inexplicable certainty that he was important somehow. Mrs. Eldridge's warnings echoed in her mind, but Katherine had never been good at staying away from challenges. Everything changed on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late June. Katherine had been in Jerome for nearly a month, and she had decided to venture further from the main street to visit some of the more isolated mining families. Mrs. Eldridge had warned against going alone, but Katherine was determined to reach as many people as possible. She followed a narrow path up the mountainside, her basket of supplies growing heavy on her arm. The sun beat down relentlessly, and she paused several times to catch her breath in the thin air. She was beginning to think she had taken a wrong turn when she heard voices ahead, low and menacing. Katherine rounded a bend and froze. 3 men stood in the path, and even from a distance, she could tell they were drunk and looking for trouble. They hadn't seen her yet, and every instinct screamed at her to turn back quietly. But before she could move, one of them looked up and spotted her. His face split into an ugly grin. Well, what do we have here? Katherine's heart hammered against her ribs as the men spread out, blocking the path. She clutched her basket tighter and tried to keep her voice steady. "Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Miss Morgan, the missionary. I was just visiting some families up the mountain." "A missionary," one of them said, laughing. "Ain't that sweet? Come to save our souls, darling." The tallest of the 3 stepped closer, and Katherine could smell the whiskey on him. "Maybe we don't want our souls saved. Maybe we like them just the way they are." Katherine's mouth went dry. She looked around desperately, but the path was empty, no help in sight. "Please let me pass. I don't want any trouble." "We don't want any trouble either," the tall one said, still advancing. "Just want to have a little chat with the pretty lady. Real friendly-like." Katherine took a step backward and stumbled on the rocky path. She would have fallen if the man hadn't grabbed her arm, his grip painful and bruising. Terror flooded through her as she struggled to pull away. "Let her go." The voice was hard as iron, cutting through the air with unmistakable authority. Katherine and her assailants all turned to see a man standing further up the path, silhouetted against the bright sky. Even backlit, she recognized him from his height and bearing. Quentin Jameson. The tall man's grip on Katherine tightened. "This ain't your business, Jameson. Move along." Quentin came closer, and Katherine could see his face now. He wasn't drunk, not this time. His gray eyes were clear and cold, fixed on the men with an intensity that made her shiver. "I said let her go, Garrett. I won't say it again." "You planning to make us?" Garrett sneered, though Katherine noticed he had released her arm. "There's 3 of us." "Won't matter." Quentin's voice was calm, almost conversational. "You'll still lose, and you know it." The tension stretched taut as a wire. Katherine stood frozen, afraid that any movement would snap the fragile standoff. The other 2 men exchanged glances, clearly calculating their odds. Finally, Garrett spat in the dust. "She ain't worth the trouble anyway. Come on, boys." The 3 men brushed past Quentin, giving him a wide berth. Katherine watched them go, her whole body shaking with delayed reaction. When she tried to take a step, her legs nearly gave out. Quentin caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. "Easy there. You're all right now." Katherine looked up at him, really seeing him for the first time. He was younger than she had expected, probably not much older than 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that would have been handsome without the marks of hard living etched into it. His clothes were work-worn but clean, and his eyes, those striking gray eyes, held more intelligence and sadness than she had anticipated. "Thank you," she managed, her voice shaky. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "Nothing good." His jaw tightened. "What were you thinking, coming up here alone? Don't you know how dangerous it is?" The criticism stung, partly because she knew he was right. "I was trying to reach some of the families who live further up the mountain. I didn't realize that there are men in this town who wouldn't hesitate to hurt a woman." Quentin released her arm and stepped back. "Well, now you know. Best stick to the main streets from now on." He turned to leave, and Katherine found herself calling after him. "Wait. I don't even know your name." He glanced back over his shoulder, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "Yes, you do. I heard Garrett say it. I'm Quentin Jameson, the town drunk and general no account. And you're the missionary lady come to save us all from our wicked ways." "Katherine Morgan," she said, ignoring the mockery in his tone. "And I don't believe you're beyond saving, Mr. Jameson." This time he did laugh, though it was a bitter sound. "Shows what you know, Miss Morgan. Now get yourself back to town before you run into more trouble. I might not be around next time." He strode away before she could respond, disappearing around a bend in the path. Katherine stood there for a long moment, her heart still racing, but no longer entirely from fear. Something had shifted in that brief encounter. Some connection had formed that she didn't fully understand. When she finally made her way back to the boarding house, Mrs. Eldridge took one look at her disheveled appearance and demanded an explanation. Katherine told her about the men on the path, though she downplayed the danger, not wanting to cause unnecessary alarm. "And Quentin Jameson rescued you?" Mrs. Eldridge looked skeptical. "I'm surprised he was sober enough to be of use." "He wasn't drunk at all," Katherine said quietly. "And he was very kind." "Kind," Mrs. Eldridge snorted. "The man's a menace, Miss Morgan. Just because he did one decent thing doesn't erase his character. I hope you won't let this incident cloud your judgment." But Katherine's judgment felt clearer than ever. She had seen something in Quentin Jameson's eyes, a pain that mirrored her own in ways she couldn't quite name. He wasn't just a drunk or a troublemaker. He was a lost soul crying out for help, even if he didn't realize it himself. That night, she prayed for him specifically, asking God to guide her in reaching him. She didn't know how she would do it, only that she had to try. He had saved her life today. Perhaps she could return the favor in a different way. The next morning, Katherine walked to the general store with a specific purpose. Mr. Walsh greeted her with his usual cheerfulness. "Miss Morgan, what can I do for you today?" "I'd like to purchase some coffee, please. The good kind, not the cheap stuff, and some decent tobacco if you have it." Mr. Walsh's eyebrows rose, but he gathered the items without comment. As he wrapped them, he said carefully, "Planning to take up smoking, miss?" "They're a gift," Katherine said firmly, "for someone who helped me yesterday." Understanding dawned on Walsh's face. "Ah. Well, Jameson does favor this particular blend of tobacco, and he takes his coffee black and strong. You've got good intelligence." Katherine paid for the items and tucked them into her basket. "Mr. Walsh, what do you know about Mr. Jameson? Where he comes from, why he's here?" Walsh leaned against the counter, considering. "Not much. He doesn't talk about his past. Showed up in Jerome about 2 years ago, took a job in the mines. Works hard when he's sober, which used to be most of the time. This past year, though, something changed." Started drinking heavy, getting into fights. Shame, really. He's a decent man underneath it all. Why do you think he changed? Couldn't say. Like I mentioned, he doesn't talk about personal matters, but I'd wager it has something to do with why he left Texas. A man doesn't run that far without a good reason. Katherine thanked him for the information and the supplies. She spent the rest of the morning debating how to deliver her gift without seeming forward or inappropriate. Finally, she decided the straightforward approach was best. She would simply thank him for his help and offer the items as a token of appreciation. Finding him proved easier than expected. Timothy mentioned that Quentin usually ate lunch at a small cantina near the mines. Katherine made her way there just after noon, her heart beating faster than the walk warranted. The cantina was little more than a shack with a few rough tables outside. Quentin sat alone at one of them, eating beans and tortillas, a cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up as Katherine approached, surprise crossing his face. "Miss Morgan, you're a long way from the respectable part of town." "I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday," Katherine said, setting her basket on the table. "I brought you some coffee and tobacco." "Mr. Walsh said you favored these kinds." Quentin stared at the basket, then at her, clearly taken aback. "You didn't need to do that. I wanted to. You saved me from a very frightening situation. Please accept them." He was quiet for a long moment, something complicated passing across his face. Finally, he nodded. "Thank you, that's kind of you." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "You want to sit? The food here's not fancy, but it's good." Katherine hesitated only briefly before settling into the chair. "I've already eaten, thank you, but I wouldn't mind talking for a few minutes if you have time. I've got 30 minutes before I need to be back at the mine." He took a sip of his coffee, watching her over the rim. "What does a missionary want to talk to me about? Besides my immortal soul, I mean." "Actually, I was hoping you might tell me about yourself. Where you're from, how you came to Jerome." Quentin's expression shuddered. "Nothing much to tell. I'm from Texas, grew up on a ranch. Decided ranching wasn't for me, came west to try mining. End of story." The brevity of the account told Katherine there was much more he wasn't saying, but she didn't push. "Do you have family back in Texas?" "Had." The word was short, final. "My parents died of fever when I was 24. No siblings, no wife or children, nobody waiting for me anywhere." The loneliness in that statement pierced Katherine's heart. "I'm sorry. I lost my mother 3 years ago. My father passed when I was young. I know how it feels to be alone in the world." Quentin looked at her with new interest. "Is that why you became a missionary? Looking for a family?" The question caught her off guard with its perceptiveness. "Perhaps, in part. I wanted to do something meaningful with my life, something that mattered. And yes, I suppose I was looking for a community, a sense of belonging." "And have you found it here in Jerome?" He sounded genuinely curious. Katherine considered the question honestly. "Not yet, but I'm hopeful. I believe God brought me here for a reason." "God?" Quentin set down his coffee cup with a hollow thunk. "I used to believe in all that. My mother was a devout woman, raised me up proper. Said prayers every night, went to church every Sunday. Lot of good it did her when the fever came." "I'm sorry you lost your faith along with your family," Katherine said softly. "But faith isn't about avoiding suffering. It's about finding meaning and hope even in the midst of it. Is that what you tell yourself when things get hard?" There was no mockery in his voice now, only a weary kind of interest. "Does it help?" "Yes," Katherine said simply. "It does. Not every day and not in the way I always expect. But believing that there's a greater purpose, that love and goodness will ultimately prevail, it gives me strength to keep going." Quentin was quiet, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the rough wood table. "You really believe that?" "After seeing a place like Jerome, After meeting men like those who threatened you yesterday, you still think goodness prevails. I think goodness has the potential to prevail if enough people choose it, and I think you're evidence of that. You chose to help me yesterday when you could have walked away. Maybe I just don't like bullies. Maybe, Katherine agreed. Or maybe there's more good in you than you want to admit. A bell rang somewhere in the distance, signaling the end of the lunch break. Quentin stood, draining the last of his coffee. I need to get back to work. Thank you for the gifts, Miss Morgan. That was thoughtful. Katherine rose as well. You're welcome. And please, if you ever want to talk or if you need anything, I'm staying at Mrs. Eldridge's boarding house. Something that looked like regret crossed his face. Better for you if you don't get too friendly with me, miss. I'm not good company, and I'd hate to damage your reputation. People in this town already talk enough. I'm not concerned with gossip, Katherine said firmly. I'm concerned with people. With you. Quentin looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to figure out if she was real. Then he shook his head slowly, picked up the basket with the coffee and tobacco, and walked away toward the mines. Katherine watched him go, feeling that strange pull again, that certainty that their paths were meant to cross. Over the following weeks, a peculiar pattern developed. Katherine would encounter Quentin in town, sometimes by chance, sometimes by design. They would talk, brief conversations that rarely lasted more than a few minutes, but which gradually revealed more about each other. She learned that he had been a skilled horseman in Texas, that he loved reading but rarely had access to books, that he played the harmonica when he thought no one was listening. He learned that she had taught Sunday school back in Philadelphia, that she missed the ocean even though she loved the mountains, that she had a weakness for peppermint candy, and a terrible sense of direction. Their friendship, if it could be called that, existed in the margins of propriety. Katherine was careful not to visit him at the saloon or anywhere else that might cause real scandal, but she made a point of greeting him on the street, of bringing him books she borrowed from Miss Patterson, of inviting him to church services even though he never came. Mrs. Eldridge noticed and disapproved. You're wasting your time on that man, Miss Morgan. He's been drunk 4 nights this week already. Sheriff Thompson says he's going to lock him up for good if he causes any more trouble. But Katherine also noticed things Mrs. Eldridge didn't. Like how Quentin had started showing up to work on time more often. How his drinking, while still excessive, had decreased slightly. How he had broken up 2 more fights in town rather than starting them. Small changes, perhaps, but changes nonetheless. It was early August when everything shifted again. Katherine had organized a small fundraiser to purchase hymnals for the Sunday services, a bake sale that she held outside the general store on a Saturday afternoon. The event was modestly successful, raising enough money to order a dozen books from Prescott. As she was packing up the remaining baked goods, Quentin appeared, looking more sober than she had seen him in weeks. Heard you were raising money for church books, he said without preamble. He held out a leather pouch. Wanted to contribute. Katherine opened the pouch and gasped. There were at least $20 inside, far more than she had raised all afternoon. Quentin, I can't accept this. It's too much. It's my money, earned fair and square. I want the church to have it. He shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable. My mother would have liked knowing her son helped buy hymnals. Seems fitting. Tears pricked Katherine's eyes at the gesture. Thank you. This is incredibly generous. Don't make a big deal of it, he said gruffly. And don't tell anyone it came from me. I've got a reputation to maintain as the town reprobate. Katherine smiled through her tears. Your secret is safe with me. But she couldn't resist asking, will you come to the service tomorrow, just once? You don't have to stay the whole time if you don't want to. Quentin looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Want versus fear, Hope versus cynicism. "I'll think about it," he finally said, which was more than he had ever conceded before. He didn't come to the service the next day, and Katherine tried not to feel disappointed. She reminded herself that faith was a journey, not a destination, and that Quentin was walking that journey at his own pace. The donation alone was a huge step. But that evening, as Katherine sat on the boarding house porch trying to catch a cool breeze, Quentin appeared out of the gathering dusk. He looked nervous, his hands shoved in his pockets. "I couldn't come this morning," he said without greeting. "Too many people, too many memories. But I was wondering if maybe you'd talk to me about it, about faith and God and how you make sense of it all." Catherine's heart soared. She gestured to the empty chair beside her. "I'd be happy to. Sit with me." They talked for over 2 hours that night, as the stars came out over Jerome and the town slowly quieted around them. Quentin asked hard questions, the kind that came from genuine spiritual struggle rather than mere philosophical curiosity. Why did God allow suffering? What was the point of prayer if God already knew everything? How could one person's death on a cross 2,000 years ago possibly matter to a miner in Arizona? Katherine answered as honestly as she could, acknowledging when she didn't have complete answers, sharing her own doubts and struggles. It was the most authentic conversation about faith she had ever had, stripped of pretense and religious platitudes. "I don't know if I can ever believe the way I used to," Quentin said finally, staring up at the stars. "Too much has happened. I've seen too much darkness." "You don't have to believe the same way you did as a child," Katherine said gently. "Faith evolves as we do. It deepens and changes. The question isn't whether you can recapture what you had before, but whether you're willing to discover something new." Quentin looked at her then, really looked at her, and Katherine felt her breath catch. There was something in his eyes, a hunger that went beyond spiritual seeking. "You're remarkable, you know that. I've never met anyone like you." "I'm just a woman trying to do right," Katherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No." Quentin reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were work roughened but gentle. "You're extraordinary. You see good in people they don't see in themselves. You make me want to be better than I am." Catherine's heart hammered in her chest. This was dangerous territory, crossing lines she had never intended to cross, and yet she couldn't bring herself to move away. "You are better than you think," she whispered, the moment stretched between them charged with possibility. Then Quentin withdrew his hand and stood abruptly. "I should go. It's late and you need your rest." "Quentin." Katherine stood as well, reaching out to touch his arm. "Thank you for talking with me tonight. It means more than you know." He covered her hand briefly with his own, the contact sending warmth racing through her. "Thank you for listening, for not giving up on me." After he left, Katherine sat back down on the porch, her hand still tingling where he had touched it. She was falling in love with Quentin Jameson. The realization should have alarmed her, should have sent her to her knees in prayer for strength and guidance. Instead, she felt a deep sense of rightness, as if this had been inevitable from the moment he stepped onto that mountain path. But love wasn't simple, especially not here. Quentin was still struggling with demons she didn't fully understand. She was a missionary, expected to maintain certain standards. And there was the practical reality that she had no idea if he felt the same way. The next few weeks were both wonderful and torturous. Quentin sought her out more frequently, their conversations growing longer and more personal. He started attending church services, sitting in the back and leaving quickly afterward, but present nonetheless. His drinking decreased markedly, and Sheriff Thompson remarked to Katherine that he hadn't had to arrest Jameson in over a month. But there was a carefulness between them now, a awareness of the attraction neither quite acknowledged aloud. They didn't touch beyond the occasional accidental brush of hands. They kept their conversations where others could see, even if they couldn't hear. Katherine poured herself into her work, expanding her Bible study classes and organizing a community dinner once a week for the miners and their families. Quentin sometimes helped with these events, carrying heavy pots and rearranging tables, his presence a quiet support. The women of the church began to notice the change in him. Mrs. Chen commented that he looked healthier, less haunted. Even Mrs. Eldridge grudgingly admitted that Jameson seemed to be reforming, though she warned Katherine against getting too attached. "Men like that always fall back into old patterns," she cautioned. "Don't let yourself care too much." But it was far too late for that advice. Katherine was already deeply, irrevocably in love. The crisis came in late September. Katherine was working at the schoolhouse one afternoon, organizing donated books when Sheriff Thompson burst through the door, his face grim. "Miss Morgan, I need you to come with me. It's about Quentin Jameson." Katherine's blood turned to ice. "What happened? Is he hurt?" "Not hurt. Arrested. There was a fight at the Silver Star and he was involved. But that's not the worst of it." Thompson's expression was troubled. "A Texas Ranger came through town this morning with some wanted posters. Seems Jameson's been running from something back in Texas. They're saying he killed a man." The world seemed to tilt beneath Katherine's feet. "That's impossible. Quentin wouldn't." "I don't know what he would or wouldn't do, Miss Morgan. I only know what the warrant says. He's being held until the ranger can take him back to Texas to stand trial." Katherine grabbed her shawl with shaking hands. "Take me to him, please." The jail was a small stone building behind the sheriff's office. Quentin sat in the single cell, his head in his hands. He looked up when Katherine entered, and the despair on his face nearly broke her. "You shouldn't be here," he said hoarsely. "You shouldn't associate with a wanted man." Katherine gripped the bars of the cell, not caring what Sheriff Thompson thought. "Tell me what happened. Tell me the truth." Quentin stood and walked to the bars, close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "The man I killed was named Richard Caldwell. He owned the ranch next to my family's spread. When my parents died, he tried to buy our land cheap, said I didn't have what it took to run it alone. I refused." He paused, his jaw working. "Caldwell started making trouble, cutting fences, poisoning water holes, running off my cattle. I tried to handle it legal, but he had the sheriff in his pocket. Then one night, he and his men came to burn me out. There was a fight. I shot Caldwell in self-defense, but his men swore I murdered him in cold blood." "Why didn't you stay and prove your innocence?" Katherine asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Because Caldwell's family practically owned the county. I wouldn't have gotten a fair trial, would have hanged for sure. So I ran." He reached through the bars and took her hands, his grip desperate. "I'm not proud of running, Katherine, but I'm not sorry for defending my home and my life. Caldwell would have killed me that night if I hadn't shot first." Katherine's mind raced. Self-defense is a legal defense. If you can prove what really happened, how? Quentin's laugh was bitter. "Caldwell's men will testify against me. I have no witnesses to support my story, and I've been running for 2 years, which makes me look guilty." "Then I'll come with you to Texas. I'll testify to your character. I'll help you find witnesses, find proof." Quentin's eyes widened. "Katherine, no. You'd ruin your reputation, destroy everything you've built here. I won't let you do that." "You don't have a choice in the matter," Katherine said fiercely. "I love you, Quentin Jameson. I'm not going to stand by and let you face this alone." The confession hung in the air between them. Quentin stared at her, emotions warring across his face. "You love me," he said finally, his voice rough with wonder. "Katherine, I'm a wanted man, a drunk, someone with nothing to offer you but trouble. You're a good man who's been running from pain, Katherine corrected. A man who saved my life, who's been fighting to find his way back to faith, who makes me feel more alive than I've ever felt before. So yes, I love you, desperately. Quentin pulled her hands through the bars and pressed them to his face. I love you too. God help me, I love you so much. But Katherine, you have to understand what going to Texas means. If I'm convicted, they'll hang me. And if you're there, if you've testified for me, it could destroy you too. I don't care about that. I care about you, about the truth. We'll face this together. Sheriff Thompson cleared his throat from the doorway. Miss Morgan, the ranger wants to leave for Texas day after tomorrow. If you're serious about going, you'll need to make arrangements. Katherine turned to him. I'm completely serious, and I'll need to send a telegram to a lawyer in Dallas. Someone who can help us build a proper defense. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Katherine sent telegrams to the Missionary Society and to a law firm in Dallas that Mr. Walsh recommended. She packed a small bag over Mrs. Eldridge's strenuous objections. This is madness, the older woman protested. Throwing away your position here, your reputation, for a man you barely know. What will people say? Let them say what they will, Katherine replied calmly. I'm doing what I believe is right. Timothy and some of the other church members came to say goodbye, clearly torn between disapproval and admiration. Miss Patterson gave Katherine a fierce hug. You're braver than I am, she whispered. I hope he's worth it. He is, Katherine said with certainty. The journey to Texas took nearly 2 weeks, traveling by stage and then by train. The Texas Ranger, a granite-faced man named Morrison, allowed Katherine to ride in the same coach as Quentin, though his hands remained shackled. They talked for hours, planning their defense, but also sharing their pasts more fully than they ever had before. Quentin told her about growing up on the ranch, about the happy years before his parents died, about his dreams of building something lasting, a legacy to pass down, about how Caldwell's greed had destroyed everything. Katherine shared her own losses, the loneliness of her childhood after her father died, the crushing grief when her mother followed him, the sense of purposelessness that had driven her to missionary work, searching for meaning in service. I thought Jerome was where I was meant to be, she said softly, watching the landscape roll past. But maybe I was just meant to find you. Quentin touched her face with his bound hands. If I'd known you were waiting at the end of this road, I might have run toward it instead of away. They arrived in Dallas on a crisp October morning. The lawyer Katherine had contacted, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Robertson, met them at the station. He had already begun investigating the case. The evidence against you is circumstantial, Robertson explained as they walked to his office. Caldwell was indeed shot on your property, but his men's testimony conflicts in several places. I've also discovered that Caldwell had been in financial trouble, which gives credence to your claim that he was trying to acquire your land through intimidation. Can you win the case? Katherine asked directly. Robertson met her eyes. I can give him a fighting chance, but I'll need witnesses to testify about Caldwell's character, about the trouble he caused, and it would help tremendously to have someone speak to Jameson's character. I'll testify, Katherine said immediately. With all due respect, Miss Morgan, you've only known him a few months. The prosecution will tear that apart. We need people who knew him before, who can speak to his integrity. Quentin's expression darkened. Most of the people who knew me before are either dead or were Caldwell's friends. I don't have anyone, but Robertson smiled slightly. Actually, you do. I've located your foreman, a man named Joseph Martinez. He left the area after you fled, but he's willing to testify about Caldwell's harassment and the night of the shooting. He was there, Jameson. He saw what happened. Hope flickered in Quentin's eyes for the first time in days. "Joe's alive. Where is he?" "Working on a ranch outside Fort Worth. I've already taken his deposition and he's agreed to come to the trial. His testimony could be pivotal." The trial was set for 3 weeks later, giving Robertson time to prepare the defense. Quentin was held in the Dallas jail, and Katherine took a room at a modest boarding house nearby. She visited him every day, bringing books and food, her presence a constant comfort. She also worked with Robertson, helping him understand Quentin's character and faith journey. The lawyer was skeptical at first about including religious testimony, but Katherine convinced him it was important. "The jury needs to see him as a whole person," she argued. "Not just a man who shot someone, but a man of faith and conscience who acted to preserve his own life." The trial began on a cold November morning. The courtroom was packed with curious onlookers, and Katherine sat in the front row, her hands clasped in prayer. Quentin sat at the defense table in clothes Robertson had purchased for him, looking more like the rancher he had been than the miner he had become. The prosecution presented its case first, calling Caldwell's men to testify. They painted Quentin as a violent, unstable man who had shot their employer without provocation. But under Robertson's cross-examination, their stories began to unravel. Details didn't match, timelines conflicted. Then Robertson called Joseph Martinez to the stand. The former foreman was a weathered man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who had worked hard all his life. He testified clearly and calmly about Caldwell's campaign of harassment, about the threats and sabotage. "I was there the night Mr. Caldwell came to the ranch," Martinez said. "He and 4 of his men, all armed. They told Mr. Jameson to sign over the deed or they'd burn the house with him in it. Mr. Jameson refused. Caldwell drew his gun first. Mr. Jameson only fired to save his own life." "Why didn't you testify to this at the time?" The prosecutor demanded on cross-examination. "Because Caldwell's family threatened my family," Martinez said steadily. "They said if I spoke up, my wife and children would suffer. So I kept quiet and I've regretted it every day since. When Mr. Robertson found me, I knew I had to tell the truth, no matter the cost." Katherine testified next, her heart pounding as she took the stand. She spoke about meeting Quentin, about his character and his faith journey. The prosecutor tried to discredit her, suggesting she was a lovesick girl blinded by infatuation. "Miss Morgan, isn't it true that you've known the defendant for less than 4 months?" he demanded. "Yes," Katherine said clearly, "but in that time, I've seen him risk his life to protect a stranger. I've watched him fight his way back from despair and addiction. I've witnessed his integrity, his compassion, his commitment to becoming a better man. 4 months is more than enough time to recognize true character." Finally, Quentin took the stand. He told his story simply and honestly, not shying away from the fact that he had shot Caldwell, but making clear it was self-defense. He acknowledged running rather than facing trial, explaining his certainty that he wouldn't receive justice. "I'm not proud of running," he said. "But I was 26 years old, alone, and terrified. I made the choice I thought would keep me alive. I never stopped regretting it, not just because it meant living as a fugitive, but because it meant leaving behind everything my parents had built." The prosecutor hammered him on cross-examination, trying to paint him as a coward and a killer. But Quentin remained calm, answering each question with steady honesty. The closing arguments took an entire afternoon. The prosecutor argued that Quentin was a murderer who had evaded justice for 2 years. Robertson countered that he was a victim defending his home and his life against a powerful, corrupt man who believed he could take whatever he wanted. "Quentin Jameson is not perfect," Robertson concluded. "He made mistakes. He ran when perhaps he should have stayed and fought. But he is not a murderer. He is a man who chose life over death, survival over surrender, and he deserves the chance to reclaim the life that was stolen from him. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Katherine sat in the courtroom the entire time, praying without ceasing. When the jury finally returned, her heart was beating so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant, Quentin Jameson, not guilty of murder." The courtroom erupted. Katherine felt tears streaming down her face as Quentin turned to look at her, his own eyes wet. The judge banged his gavel for order, then addressed the jury. "The court accepts the verdict. Mr. Jameson, you are free to go." In the chaos that followed, Katherine fought her way through the crowd to reach Quentin. He met her halfway, pulling her into his arms and holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. Neither of them spoke. There were no words for the relief and joy and love coursing between them. Outside the courthouse, Robertson shook Quentin's hand. "You're a free man, Jameson. I've also taken the liberty of looking into your ranch. Caldwell's estate has been in probate for the past 2 years. You have a legal claim to reclaim your property." Quentin looked stunned. "After all this time?" "The land was never legally transferred. It's still yours if you want it." That evening, Katherine and Quentin walked along the Trinity River as the sun set over Dallas. Free for the first time in 2 years, Quentin seemed almost uncertain, as if he didn't quite trust his good fortune. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and find this is all a dream," he admitted, holding Katherine's hand. "That I'm still in that cell or back in the mine and none of this is real." "It's real," Katherine assured him. "You're free, Quentin. You can go home." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I don't want to go home unless you're coming with me. Katherine, I know this is fast. I know we haven't courted properly. But will you marry me? Will you be my wife and help me rebuild what was lost?" Katherine's breath caught. She had hoped, dreamed, but hadn't dared to expect this. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, absolutely yes." Quentin kissed her then, right there on the riverbank, and Katherine felt as if her heart might take flight. This was what she had been searching for all along. Not just purpose or community, but love. Complete, transforming, redemptive love. They were married 2 weeks later in a small church in Dallas, with Robertson and his wife as witnesses. Katherine wore a simple cream-colored dress purchased from a local dressmaker, and Quentin wore a new suit that made him look like the respectable rancher he had once been. The ceremony was brief, but deeply moving. As they exchanged vows, Katherine felt God's presence surrounding them, blessing this union that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. She had traveled west to save souls, never imagining that in saving Quentin, she would find her own salvation. They traveled to Quentin's ranch in early December, arriving to find the property abandoned but still standing. The house needed work, the fences had to be rebuilt, and the land had run wild in his absence. But it was theirs, a fresh start built on truth and love. Katherine sent a telegram to the Missionary Society, explaining that she would not be returning to Jerome. She recommended Timothy for the position, knowing he had both the faith and the gentle spirit needed to reach that rough town. She also wrote to Mrs. Eldridge, thanking her for her hospitality and explaining her decision. The response from Mrs. Eldridge surprised her. "I may not have approved of your methods, but I cannot deny the results. You saved that man's soul and found your own happiness. Perhaps there is more than one way to do God's work. May you have every blessing in your new life." The first year of marriage was harder than Katherine had anticipated. Ranching was brutal work, especially with just the two of them to do everything. They hired a few hands as money allowed, including Joseph Martinez, who returned to work for the man he had once fled to protect. Katherine learned to tend animals, to preserve food, to manage a household under primitive conditions. Her hands, once soft and suited for turning Bible pages, became calloused from labor. But she had never been happier. Working alongside Quentin, building something together, filled her with a satisfaction no amount of missionary work had ever provided. Quentin threw himself into rebuilding the ranch, working from dawn until dark. But he also made time for the things that mattered. Every evening, no matter how exhausted, they would sit together and read or talk or simply be in each other's presence. On Sundays, they attended the small church in the nearest town, and Katherine helped establish a Bible study group for the ranch families in the area. The darkness that had driven Quentin to drink and despair gradually lifted. There were still hard days, moments when grief or fear threatened to overwhelm him. But he had learned to face those demons rather than fleeing into a bottle. Katherine's love and faith provided an anchor, a reminder that he was not alone in the struggle. In the spring of 1880, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. They were still struggling to make the ranch profitable, and bringing a child into such uncertainty seemed daunting. But Katherine had never doubted that children were part of God's plan for them. "We'll manage," Quentin said, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "We've faced worse than this and come through. We'll love this baby and raise them right, and that's what matters." Their son was born in late October, a robust baby boy with Quentin's gray eyes and Katherine's dark hair. They named him Samuel, after Quentin's father, and he became the light of their lives. Katherine had never known love could expand this way, encompassing not just her husband but this tiny, perfect human they had created together. Motherhood transformed Katherine in unexpected ways. She had thought her work as a missionary was the highest calling, but raising Samuel, teaching him about love and faith and goodness, felt like an even more sacred trust. She still found ways to serve the community, organizing aid for struggling families and teaching Sunday school in town. But her primary mission had become her family, and she embraced it wholeheartedly. The ranch slowly prospered. Quentin proved to be as skilled at ranching as his father had been, and his reputation for integrity and fair dealing spread. They acquired more land, hired more hands, and began to build something substantial. By 1883, they were among the more successful ranchers in the area. In the summer of that year, Katherine gave birth to their daughter, Rachel. She was a quieter baby than Samuel had been, with solemn eyes that seemed to take in everything. Quentin adored her, this tiny girl who had him wrapped around her finger from the first moment. "I never imagined this life," he told Katherine one evening as they watched the children play in the yard. Samuel, now nearly 3, was trying to teach Rachel to walk, holding her chubby hands with exaggerated gentleness. "After everything that happened, I thought I was destined to die alone and forgotten. But you gave me hope, Katherine. You gave me everything." Katherine leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "We gave each other everything. You saved my life that day on the mountain, but you did more than that. You saved me from a life of going through the motions, of serving out of duty rather than love. You showed me what it means to truly connect with another person." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching their children, their ranch, their life spreading out before them. It wasn't the life Katherine had planned when she boarded that stagecoach in Philadelphia. It was infinitely better. As the years passed, the ranch continued to thrive. Samuel grew into a thoughtful, responsible boy who loved working with the horses. Rachel developed a quick mind and a gentle spirit, often accompanying Katherine on her visits to neighboring families. In 1886, They welcomed twin boys, James and Joseph, named after Quentin's mother's father and their faithful foreman. The twins brought chaos and laughter to the household in equal measure. They were constantly getting into mischief, but their joy was infectious. Quentin, now in his late 30s, proved to have unexpected patience with their antics. Katherine often found him on the floor playing with the boys, building elaborate structures from blocks or telling wild stories that made them shriek with laughter. Katherine maintained her missionary work in a different form. She and Quentin opened their home every Sunday afternoon for Bible study and prayer, welcoming ranch families, townspeople, and anyone who wanted to come. Their table was always open, their door always unlocked. They had been saved by grace and compassion, and they were determined to extend the same to others. In 1888, Jerome's new minister, who turned out to be Timothy, came to visit. He had married Miss Patterson, and they had 2 children of their own. The reunion was joyful, filled with shared memories and updates. "You were right to leave when you did," Timothy told Katherine as they sat on the porch. "Your story, the way you stood by Quentin and helped him reclaim his life, it became legendary in Jerome. It changed how people thought about redemption and second chances. I've used it in sermons more times than I can count." Katherine smiled, watching Quentin and Timothy's wife corral the children for supper. "I didn't do it to set an example. I did it because I loved him, because I couldn't imagine a life without him in it." "That's what makes it powerful," Timothy said. "It wasn't about duty or obligation, it was about love, and love is always the most transformative force." By 1890, Samuel was nearly 10, already talking about taking over the ranch someday. Rachel, at 7, had discovered a love of books and spent hours reading everything she could get her hands on. The twins, now 4, were a whirlwind of energy that kept everyone on their toes. Quentin had aged well, the hardness that had marked him in Jerome replaced by laugh lines and contentment. His hair showed threads of silver, and his hands bore the scars of ranch work, but he was healthy and happy. The demons that had once driven him to drink were long vanquished, replaced by the peace of a man who had found his purpose. Katherine, now 34, had never imagined she could feel so complete. Motherhood had rounded her figure and put strands of gray in her dark hair, but Quentin still looked at her with the same wonder he had shown that night on the boarding house porch. Their love had deepened over the years, weathering challenges and growing stronger through shared joy and sorrow. In the fall of 1890, they received word that Mrs. Eldridge had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Though they had only corresponded occasionally over the years, Katherine mourned the loss of the woman who had first brought her to Jerome. In her will, Mrs. Eldridge left a portion of her savings to Katherine with a note that read, "For the missionary who taught me that salvation comes in many forms." Katherine used the money to establish a small library in the nearest town, stocking it with books for children and adults alike. It seemed a fitting tribute to the woman who had disapproved of so much, but who had, in her own way, helped set Katherine on the path to her true calling. The ranch continued to prosper through the 1890s. They weathered droughts and market downturns, always emerging stronger. Quentin's reputation as an honest rancher and Katherine's tireless community work made them pillars of the local society. But they never forgot where they had come from, the desperation and grace that had brought them together. In 1895, on their 17th wedding anniversary, Quentin took Katherine to the spot where they had first met, that mountain path outside Jerome. They had traveled there on a rare trip away from the ranch, leaving the children in Joseph Martinez's capable care. "I think about that day all the time," Quentin said, standing where he had first confronted the men threatening her. How close I came to just walking past. I was drunk more often than not in those days. I could have been too far gone to care, too wrapped up in my own misery to notice you needed help. But you weren't, Katherine said, taking his hand. Some part of you was still fighting to surface, still capable of doing the right thing. That's what I saw in you from the beginning, that core of goodness struggling to break through. You saved me, Quentin said softly. I know the story is supposed to be that I saved you, and I did, from those men. But Katherine, you saved my life in every way that matters. You gave me hope when I had none, love when I thought I was unlovable, purpose when I believed I was worthless. You are the greatest gift God ever gave me. Tears streamed down Katherine's face. We saved each other, she said firmly. I was lost too in my own way. Searching for meaning in all the wrong places, trying to fill an emptiness I didn't understand. You showed me that love, real love, is the greatest ministry. That building a life with someone, raising children, creating a home, that's as sacred as any mission work could ever be. They held each other as the Arizona sun set over Jerome, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Somewhere down the mountain, the town continued its rough, rowdy existence. But up here, in this moment, there was only peace and love and gratitude. By the turn of the century, the ranch had grown into one of the largest and most successful in the region. Samuel, now 19, was being courted by the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a sensible girl named Elizabeth, who Katherine approved of wholeheartedly. Rachel, at 17, had just accepted a position as a teacher in town, following in Miss Patterson's footsteps. The twins were 13, still causing trouble but showing signs of the fine men they would become. Quentin and Katherine, now in their mid-40s and early 40s respectively, looked forward to the next chapter of their lives. Grandchildren would come eventually, and they would have more time to travel, to serve their community in new ways, to simply enjoy the life they had built together. On a warm evening in June 1900, the family gathered for supper on the wide porch Quentin had built years ago. Katherine watched her children, now mostly grown, laughing and talking with their father. Samuel was animatedly describing his plans for expanding the horse breeding program. Rachel was reading aloud from a new book she had acquired. The twins were engaged in some kind of complicated game that seemed to involve a lot of shouting. This was her legacy, Katherine realized. Not the souls saved in Jerome, not the Bible studies or the fundraisers or the missionary work. This family, built on love and faith and second chances. This home, filled with laughter and purpose. This life, so different from anything she had imagined but so much richer than any plan she could have devised. Quentin caught her eye across the table and smiled, that same smile that had first cracked through his defenses all those years ago in Jerome. In that smile, Katherine saw everything they had been and everything they would become. Two lost souls who had found each other against all odds, who had fought for their love and built something beautiful from the ashes of despair. She had traveled west as a missionary, determined to save others. Instead, she had found a cowboy who needed saving, and in the process of saving him, she had discovered that she needed saving too. They had rescued each other, redeemed each other, remade each other into the people they were meant to be. As the stars came out over the Texas ranch, Katherine offered a silent prayer of gratitude. For Quentin, for their children, for the life they had built together. For the grace that had brought them through darkness into light, for the love that had transformed everything. The missionary and the cowboy, the lost woman and the lost man had found their way home. Together, always together. And in that togetherness, they had discovered the greatest salvation of all, the kind that came not from sermons or good works, but from two hearts choosing each other, day after day, year after year, through every trial and every triumph. Their story had begun on a dusty mountain path in Jerome, Arizona, with an act of courage that saved a life. It had continued through trials and tribulation, through courtrooms and cattle drives, through the sacred work of building a family and a future. And it would go on, their love rippling outward through their children and grandchildren, through the community they had served and the lives they had touched. Katherine Morgan Jameson had come west to bring salvation to others. Instead, she had found it herself, in the most unexpected of places, in the arms of a man who had been as lost as she was. Together, they had created not just a life, but a testimony to the transformative power of love, faith, and second chances. And that, Katherine thought as Quentin reached for her hand across the table, their children's laughter ringing out into the night, was the greatest mission she could have ever hoped to fulfill.